Society Matters.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Legacy Chronicles. I am Zachary Graulich, the Assistant Director of Education here at HMTC, and I am joined today by second-generation Holocaust survivor, Esther Jamnik. Thanks so much for being here, Esther.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Yeah. So you've been involved in our community for a little while now. So why don't you start off by sharing with us a little bit about your family history? I know you speak about your father here primarily at the museum when you speak to student groups. So tell me a little bit about him and what his experience was in surviving.
So my dad was born in 1925 in a small town in north central Poland, at that time close to the border of Germany. And so he was basically thrown into the war pretty early on, and he was separated from his parents at the age of 14, never to see them again. He ended up in Auschwitz for most of his time there, in and out until finally doing the death march and ending up in a bunch of different camps through the way and getting liberated from a camp in Bavaria, ultimately surviving that. And my mom also is a survivor, she's still alive. Thank God. She's also a survivor. She had a totally different story, which I am going to be working on writing as well. Hers was more of like escaping through like Russia and, surviving, the brutal, where her father was killed and, her mother was left to raise her and my uncle, who she was pregnant with at the time. So they have a totally different survival story.
Wow.
And
Wow. So have you always known, growing up, was it always just something you kind of knew that you were a child of survivors? Was it talked about in your house?
Surprisingly, no. When I was really young, I do have much older siblings. That's a whole other story, but my siblings are much older than me. I'm kind of one of the younger children of survivors. So I think I was a little sheltered. I did go to a yeshiva growing up, and there was, Yom HaShoah. I did know my father had numbers on his arm, but like actually talking about it, it was like there were stories, but my father really didn't speak about it growing up. So as I got older, I started to understand what the numbers mean and the impact that, it had on our entire family life.
Right, absolutely, which is so interesting because for every 2G, it's a completely different experience. Some knew right away and some found out much later, and some asked questions. And, given the circumstance of their parents, some wanted to talk about it and some didn't. So in terms of, your experience as a 2G now volunteering your time at the museum, kind of how did you start that process? How did you come here and begin to delve into that history?
It was a happy accident. So some point during lockdown, there was somebody was hosting some Zoom with a speaker from HMTC,
Irving Roth
was being hosted on this podcast. And after the podcast, somebody reached out to me and said to me, would you ever speak your parents' story, your father's story? And I said, I wouldn't even know where to begin. And magically, I manifested it. In my inbox came an invitation from HMTC that was running a course on how to write my father's story. So it was like a 6-month course with 2 instructors and a lot of guest instructors who taught us how to do the basic things on the research. I didn't even know where to start. And really cutting my father did do a video for the Shoah Project, so that made it a little easier. And I was able to, through my research, corroborate his stories and his timeline, which was important.
Amazing.
Because the one thing we were taught was, it needs to be true.
Yeah,
otherwise,
of course.
you can't be able to poke holes in your story.
Right.
It needs to be true or don't say it. So I did the research. I finished the course. We had peer group reviewers, some of who speak here as well. And it was just I wrote it, but I don't think I really intended to write it to speak so much as to have it ready for, during COVID lockdown, we postponed my father's unveiling. And the first time I spoke the story was at his unveiling to my own family, who was beyond touched and thrilled.
Yeah, what was that like?
It was enormously emotional. We came back to my house after the unveiling for a meal, and we all sat together in my den, and I played the PowerPoint on the TV and then spoke his story to my family, who, again, emotionally cried and were so touched that I took the time to write his story in a real way, because he didn't speak much about it growing up, and we had this wonderful resource of his tape, and he wasn't the most dynamic speaker. So it was like, it was difficult to get through.
Yeah.
So if I could take the important stuff and put it in a nutshell and really speak the story, that's what I spoke it. That's how I did. And then what happened is I have a friend who works in a synagogue in Brooklyn, and she needed a speaker for Yom HaShoah, which happens to be around the time of my father's yard site anyway. And I said to her I would get her in touch with HMTC to get a speaker. And she's like, no. She's, knew my parents, and, we grew up together. And she's like, no, I want you to speak. And I'm like, me? I'm not going to speak. I don't know what I'm doing. And I did it. I just ripped the Band-Aid off. I did it. And they had another speaker. And at the end of the day, she said the reviews of my speaking was so excellent that I did take the leap of faith, reached out to you or somebody, and you got back to me and said, let's do this. And you helped me polish things and ultimately helped me through my a little bit fear of speaking to all age people, school kids especially, and the various rewrites that it takes. But I have to say, it's been a wonderful journey, and hopefully what my legacy will be.
Yeah. So has carrying the torch for your family in this way, has this really, you touched on it a little bit, but is this something that you ever really predicted you would find yourself doing, or it just came out of nowhere and it's just an amazing thing?
No, it really wasn't something I ever thought I would do. When, the spark definitely ignited when somebody mentioned to me, and when this course came to me, it was kind of like all the ducks started lining up, in a row. And it all happened kind of organically.
Yeah.
But, now after speaking for a couple of years and really, fine-tuning things, and it's getting easier and easier, I've come to realize how important it is. My father's no longer with us. And to be honest, he wasn't with us for a few years before that because he had gone through a bout of dementia. He did pass away at the ripe old age of 93, which is great. My mother is still with us, and she does speak in Florida. She does. But I've come to the realization that he's not here to speak, even if it was like a simple story that had nothing to do with the atrocities that he lived through. Just a basic story of his childhood. He's not here to tell it.
Yeah.
So, he lost everybody, his siblings, his parents, his aunts, his uncles. Most of them perished in the Holocaust. So there's nobody to speak for him. So I realized once he passed away how important it is for me to be able to speak the stories, the good ones and the bad ones.
Absolutely. So does anyone else in your family, do anything related to Holocaust education? Have they considered it? Is it, where does that stand?
No, I would be considered, my father's nickname for me was Hurricane Esther. So he said when I left the house, when I got married, I sucked all the life out of it with me. So I definitely have a bit of a more dynamic personality than my older siblings. My mother does speak, like I said, so she's great. She has a very dynamic personality as well. I think even anything, eulogies, whatever, it's always been me chosen to speak because I do speak from the heart, and I don't mind getting emotional. Meaning I'm not scared to, if it makes me cry, to show the emotion and stop and pause and take a breath and continue. Where other people I know have a hard time with that, and my siblings are probably more like that. Amongst each other, we will tell stories, but they didn't really do the deep dive into the history. And they'll refer to me and ask me questions all the time.
Yeah. So you've taken on that responsibility really for your family in a way. It's a large weight to kind of bear in a sense, but I can see that you're proud to do that, to take that on for your family. There's nothing like that really. So I guess in terms of Holocaust education as a whole, even before you started this journey, were you involved in Holocaust education? Did you feel passionately about the necessity of Holocaust education, or just did this whole world of Holocaust education was just something totally kind of new to you? Totally new.
It was the opposite for me growing up. I'm going to say I did go to the yeshiva as I spoke, and we did have big Yom HaShoah events at the school, of which I generally walked out of as a teenager. It was painful for me to think of seeing somebody on some film clip or some video. Even amongst my research, I saw something that maybe even looked a little bit like my dad. I just didn't want to see anybody that looked like him.
Yeah.
It was hard to reconcile for me as in my youth. But then I started seeing things happening as I sent my own kids to day school, how few people there were with, and I did grow up in a school that was like half Sephardic and half Ashkenazi. And there were other parents, but not as many as you would think, they were more one generation removed. It was their grandparents.
Right.
It wasn't their parents. I was in a small pocket of kids who had these parents with the stories, with the tattoos, with the, coming from Eastern Europe directly. So like you kind of want to just be everybody else and you don't want to be. And then I remember somebody pointing out to my father had come to some program, like my kids something at their day school, and my father was wearing short sleeves, and somebody saw the numbers and was really touched because even at that point in the 90s, like, in the early 2000s, you just don't see too many survivors. He was kind of young and I'm kind of young and I had kids kind of young. So it was a unique experience. So no, the answer is I shied away from all of that stuff, trying to live my best life. I will say that, growing up, you understand some things organically, and maybe me intuitively. My father would get like crazed of me, like going out with my friends all the time, blah, 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 having much older siblings. I was like an only child. I relied on my friends and my social life. And like, he would get upset and my mom would kind of say like, let her live her life. And I looked at my mom and I said, I totally get it. Yeah. At 17, he was not living this life. Yeah. So those things for me were always, luckily very, very clear. That he did not live this normal, his formative years, your best years of your life, 17 to 21, were not for him. Yeah. And that was something I think I did understand as a young child, not, a teenager, an older teenager, that he didn't understand it because he didn't live it. Yeah.
So then today, with being involved here for quite some time now and really getting to this point in your journey, what does Holocaust education mean to you now in 2025 with everything going on in the world?
As with everything, it has evolved for me. It was intentional to speak my father's story because he can't any longer, and that definitely has changed, especially as I see the impact on the kids. A lot of them don't know about the Holocaust. And, I recently had a big challenge that you tasked me with, which was to speak to a non-English speaking class. So, and I did commend them for listening to the story twice, once in English and once, translated into Spanish, which was really, really taxing for them. And they stood and they did it with respect. And I really appreciate that. But at the end, I really said that to them, how much I appreciate it. But I think they connected with the parts where my father came to America as an immigrant, didn't speak the language, wanted to be an engineer, couldn't be an engineer, had this skill that he was given in the concentration camp, which was bricklaying, went forward with that, learning how to do drafting. And like, they understood that sometimes with the language barrier, you may need to pivot. So like, it's also a story of hope. It's not just a story of whatever. And ultimately it gives that little component where you can connect on a level that, hey, I come from immigrant parents, you come from immigrant parents, we made a life here, you can make a life here, but understand that we're all people in this world, in this country together, and we need to be understanding for each other. While everybody has different stories and everybody has different names for the stories, mine is very positive, as you know. It's called Keep Your Head Up, because my father knew that keeping his head up during the Holocaust was going to keep him alive, and that as we run through life and encounter all kinds of difficulties. And today, especially, where antisemitism feels kind of scary and the world feels kind of scary because you don't know who to trust and who not to trust. If we can have a dialogue and learn to kind of connect in a way unexpectedly, that we can find a small place that we can connect on and humanize each other. I think that has kind of like pivoted me a little bit in my speaking. To connect to people and humanize Jews, that we are just like you, that we live amongst you, we always have, we, God willing, always will, and we can connect on a level that makes us human and that makes you human, and that we can see you for who you are and you can see us for who we really are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you speak so highly of the connection that we're making, and that's what we strive to do every day here. You giving testimony, our docents giving museum tours. It's about making that connection and showing that we have so much more in common than we oftentimes realize, and more similarities than differences. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, and acknowledge the attack on the Jewish, advocates in Colorado yesterday,
yes.
who, are recovering now, and reportedly one of the victims is a Holocaust survivor. And so we have these attacks that are going on, unfortunately, all too frequently. And we're here every day on the ground trying to build those bridges between ourselves and our community and the kids who are walking in these doors. And as you said, oftentimes don't really know anything about the Holocaust at all. So it's powerful to talk about those connections. And you and I were speaking before the podcast about maybe even in your journey becoming, a museum docent here, leading the kids throughout the museum tour, in addition to giving testimony on behalf of your father.
Yeah, like I said earlier, this will hopefully be my legacy. And, having worked here for a couple of years and understanding the importance of the work that you do and really trying to make those base connections, doing it in an even more personal way of docenting and being able to pepper the docent situation with something personal.
Absolutely.
Will further make connections. And if we can change 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or anyone's mind to not do something as terrible and terroristic as lobbing Molotov cocktails into a crowd of Jews, reminiscent of things that happened in the time of my father as a young teenager. If we could prevent one, then my work is done. If I can prevent one, if he can prevent one, or she can prevent one, my work is done. I said, after I retire, this will be more full-time focus for me. I try and come in as much as I can, and always try and say yes if I can, because it's so important. And mainly going forward to prevent things like this happening.
Yeah. I mean, the mindset for myself, for our other educators, and of course for our survivors here, and I'm sure at other Holocaust organizations and museums across the world, is if you can reach just that one kid. You can speak to 100 kids in a room, 99 of them could, kind of blow you off, don't remember what you say. But as long as one person in that room is changed and maybe thinks about things a little differently, carries forward what it is that you shared with them, then you really are making a difference. And because that's all we're trying to do. We're just trying to educate as much as we can, build those bridges rather than tear them down, which unfortunately so many people feel the need to do today is
yes, on both sides they do. And I honestly do see the spark. It is one of the things that keeps feeding my desire to show up here and speak, is making the connection during my speaking. And I'll see the 1 or 2 or 3 kids who are going to raise their hands. I'll see the kids who are, zoned out. I'll see the kids, and I do try, at the end to engage them with my own questions.
Of course.
If they're unwilling to ask a question, I'll start the questions rolling, and that will sometimes start the question. But I do find the 1 or 2 or 3 in the group of 50 that I'm speaking to who are, they caught something, and you see it, and that's the fuel that feeds my fire.
Yeah. On that note, has there, can you think, off the top of your head of a time when you got a question that really just touched you, surprised you, or you had an interaction with a student in any way, that, or a specific group, anything like that? I mean, I know you mentioned obviously the recent one with,
Yeah, that was one group that, and they were, really, I was so impressed with their, fortitude of having to sit through it extra long.
Yeah.
But, I would say that the middle school kids seem to be, when I speak to the older middle school classes, because I do have to water down the story and maybe disengage the video part. It's a little tough. But the older middle school kids really do ask questions. And I was warned that they would, and they do. And I'll get a barrage of questions. I tell a story about my father and his friend who he saved during the death march, and the story of them reuniting later in Israel. And the kids really get delighted about that, and they'll ask questions about that. And did they meet after? And and I tell them the story of after, and they're very excited about that. And I always go into the part that always shocked me the most during my research, which is the numbers.
Yeah.
And we talk about the numbers of how this were the numbers of my father's town before the war. This is how many survived after the war, which is a minuscule amount. It goes from 7,000 to 150, most of them in Israel. After the war, I mean, 150, it was mind blowing. And then I take a moment, pause, and saying, now multiply that by every town in Eastern Europe, like in Poland, specific, and you'll get to this 6 million number. So like it breaks it down in a way. So I think the numbers, the question about the numbers, and then the question about like my father as a human being, and did he reconnect with his buddy that he saved? That's always the winner.
Yeah. And so then for kind of the next generation, looking to the future, because obviously you plan to be here for a very long time, but we want these stories to carry on forever and ever, as long as humanly possible. So for the third generation in your family, whether it be, nieces and nephews, your own kids, has there been any sort of conversation about carrying it forward from there? Or is that kind of a road that you haven't explored yet with your family?
I haven't gone down it. They love the work that I do. My kids are really proud. I have adult children, so they're really proud of the work that I do. They've heard me speak. They've gone to hear me speak live as well. And I love that. And I did sign them all up into one of the 3G groups, which is great.
Yeah.
They're still in that stage where they're, young and starting out. They haven't even started their own families yet, and starting their own lives, and still working hard to set their footprints, know?
Yeah.
And I believe that once they know and see how important it is to me, I do try and include them. If anybody's around, they're always welcome to come speak. Friends have asked me to come see me speak, and I've said, of course, these are the dates I'm speaking. So if you want to come and you're available, please come. Anybody who wants to, I'm willing to teach them how to start the process and connect them here with HMTC, because I do believe in the work so much. And I will always encourage my kids to go forward to do the important work once I cannot.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Esther. I really appreciate your time and all the work that you do here at HMTC. It's been a joy for me, being here only a short few years, and then, kind of our paths kind of crossing as the time when you were kind of finishing up your presentation, and I kind of was coming in and working with you, and getting to see that all kind of come together has really been special. And I really appreciate everything you do for us. And it's been great having you. So thank you so much for coming in today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was really, really delightful.
Absolutely. Thanks. For more information on podcasts, such as this one and all of our other series, please go to hmtcli.org. Thank you so much.